The jungle was silent, too silent. Then came the sound no Japanese soldier had ever heard before. Not gunfire, not mortars, but something deeper. A metallic growl rolling through the palm trees, shaking the ground like a coming storm. On the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, men in tattered uniforms watched as a shape emerged through the smoke. A steel beast coated in mud, its front blade glinting in the sunlight. Bullets sparked against its armor, but it didn't stop. It kept coming. It wasn't a tank. It wasn't built to kill. It was a bulldozer. Yet in the Pacific, where the jungle swallowed armies and the enemy hid in tunnels beneath the earth, this machine had become something else entirely. A weapon of unstoppable force. It buried bunkers, crushed defenses, and carved through terrain no tank could cross. The Japanese soldiers had spent years perfecting the art of defense, but no one had prepared for this, for America's machines of construction to become tools of war. That day, the bulldozer earned a new name among the men who saw it move through fire: the Steel Monster. Before the bulldozers arrived, the Pacific War was a nightmare of mud, heat, and attrition. Every island was a fortress, carved by hand, hardened by will. From the beaches of Guadalcanal to the coral ridges of Tarawa, Japanese troops fought not for territory, but for time. They dug into volcanic rock, vanished into tunnels, and turned every inch of ground into a trap. American infantrymen advanced yard by yard, under constant machine gun fire, across jungles that swallowed sound and light alike. It was a war of inches, where the enemy could be 5 feet below your boots, waiting. For the U.S. Marines and soldiers landing on these islands, the terrain itself was often deadlier than the defenders. The beaches were too soft for tanks, the jungles too thick for artillery, and the weather turned roads into rivers of mud. A tank might sink before it fired a shot. Men drowned in craters before reaching cover. Commanders quickly realized victory here wouldn't come from firepower alone. It required movement, the ability to build, clear, and reshape the battlefield itself. In 1942, as American forces prepared for their first major offensive on Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy established a new kind of unit, the construction battalions, soon known simply as the Seabees. They were carpenters, mechanics, welders, and engineers, not trained killers, but builders. Yet, within months, they would find themselves under fire, using shovels, cranes, and bulldozers as their weapons. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of waiting for an island to be secured before construction began, engineers would land with the first assault waves. Their job? Clear the beaches, build airfields, carve out roads, and turn chaos into order. All while bullets filled the air. But on those early islands, they faced an enemy unlike any they'd seen. Japanese soldiers fought to the death, often hidden in caves and pillboxes impervious to small arms. Naval guns could pound a hill for hours, and yet when the smoke cleared, defenders would still emerge, firing again. That's when the bulldozer's purpose began to shift. At first, it was a tool used to drag wrecked vehicles, dig trenches, or flatten supply zones. But in the chaos of battle, necessity became invention. Crews began fitting steel plates to their bulldozers, improvising armor against machine gun fire. They discovered that a 20-ton Caterpillar D7 could do what even tanks struggled to do: plow straight into a bunker, bury it under tons of earth, or crush it entirely. The transformation was slow, almost accidental, but by late 1943, word had spread across the Pacific. Bulldozers could fight. On islands like Bougainville and Saipan, Seabees drove their machines through swamps under sniper fire, clearing paths for infantry. They filled craters faster than Japanese artillery could create them. When enemy troops tried to retake airstrips, Bulldozers rebuilt them overnight. The machine that symbolized American construction became a symbol of unstoppable advance. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't loud, but it worked. And that mattered more than anything. The Japanese command, steeped in traditional warfare, saw it as blasphemy. Engineers fighting battles with machines meant for farms and roads. But that misunderstanding would cost them dearly. Because by 1944, the bulldozer was no longer a background tool. It was part of the front line. A weapon of war disguised as labor. And on the next island, its full potential would be unleashed. By 1944, the Pacific War had entered a new phase, one defined not by bravery alone, but by engineering. Every island captured brought the Allies a few hundred more miles closer to Japan. Each one had to be transformed, fast, into an airfield, supply base, and naval anchor. Speed was everything. Delay meant more lives lost. The bulldozer became the heartbeat of that transformation. From dawn until dusk, its engines roared across coral plains and volcanic ash. Seabees and Army engineers worked in shifts so relentless that some men slept against their machines, too tired to walk to camp. At Bougainville, the first airstrip was operational in just 16 days, built under fire, with bulldozers still dodging mortar rounds. At Tarawa, the Seabees cleared wreckage from the beach, while snipers fired from palm trees. At Guam, bulldozers carved out roads through jungles so dense that light barely reached the ground. The Japanese had never faced anything like it. Their defensive strategy was built on the assumption that terrain, not just fortifications, would slow the enemy. They believed the jungles, swamps, and ridges of the Pacific would grind any invasion into exhaustion. But the Americans simply reshaped the terrain itself. Where there was a swamp, they filled it. Where there was a hill, they flattened it. And where there was a bunker, they buried it. The bulldozer's power wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Japanese soldiers watched in disbelief as machines absorbed rifle fire, crushed palm log walls, and rolled over trenches. Some opened fire with machine guns until the barrels melted, but the steel beasts just kept coming. American commanders began to understand the strategic implications. A bulldozer could neutralize a fortified position faster, and with fewer casualties, than an infantry assault. It could clear landing zones for tanks, pull out stuck vehicles, and even create instant cover by piling sand into berms. By the time of the Marianas Campaign, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the bulldozer had become a weapon of doctrine. The Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks began issuing orders for armor plating, gun shields, and reinforced cabins. Combat bulldozers, like the Caterpillar D7 and D8, were modified for frontline use. They were slow but unstoppable, capable of pushing through shell holes and soft coral that trapped lighter vehicles. And behind them, always came the infantry. One officer later wrote, "When the bulldozers moved, the war moved." By 1945, as U.S. forces prepared for the bloodiest battles yet, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, these machines had become as vital as tanks or artillery. Entire assault plans were built around them. Commanders knew that once the bulldozers were ashore, the island would fall, no matter how fierce the resistance. But their crews paid dearly. Many Seabees were killed inside open cabs, cut down by snipers or mortars as they worked. They weren't soldiers by training, yet they fought like veterans, not with rifles, but with grit and persistence. They understood what few others did, that every foot of cleared ground meant one less Marine dying in the mud. The Pacific Campaign was changing shape. The American war machine was evolving, turning the very essence of industrial might into a weapon of movement, progress, and inevitability. And at the center of it all was one sound, the deep, steady roar of a bulldozer engine, echoing through the palm forests and over the black sand beaches, announcing that America had arrived. And it wasn't turning back. The next stage would show the full fury of that transformation. Because when the bulldozers landed at Iwo Jima, they didn't just build, they fought. Iwo Jima wasn't just a battlefield, it was a volcano-turned-fortress. The island rose from the sea like something ancient and cruel. Black sand, sulfur fumes, and tunnels carved deep into the rock. Every ridge was a bunker. Every shadow hid a gun. When the Marines hit the beach on February 19, 1945, they sank to their knees. The volcanic ash swallowed boots, jammed rifles, and trapped tanks. Within minutes, the shoreline was chaos. Waves of men pinned down under machine gun fire, unable to dig in, unable to move. And then, that sound again. Through the smoke, the bulldozers crawled ashore. They came off the landing craft coated in salt and oil, engines screaming against the incline. The men driving them weren't soldiers. They were Seabees, mechanics, welders, farmers, construction men who had traded tools for helmets. Snipers picked them off one by one. Mortars fell so close the machines lifted off the ground. But the bulldozers didn't stop. They began pushing walls of sand in front of the pinned Marines, creating cover where none existed. A single dozer could save an entire platoon. They filled shell craters, cleared wrecked vehicles, and built ramps for tanks still struggling to reach the higher ground. They carved rough roads through the ash, sometimes inches away from Japanese tunnels, not knowing if the ground beneath them was hollow. When tanks became trapped, bulldozers pushed them free, sometimes under fire so heavy the drivers couldn't even see, only feel. One Seabee wrote in his log, "We worked blind. Smoke, dust, screaming. You just kept the blade down and prayed the machine didn't die." It wasn't long before the bulldozers turned from builders to warriors. Japanese soldiers, hidden in caves, would fire on Marines, then vanish underground. So the bulldozers began sealing the caves, pushing tons of rock and sand into the openings, burying the enemy alive. It was brutal work, but it saved countless American lives. Every move they made changed the shape of the battlefield. Where the Japanese planned to make a last stand, the bulldozers simply erased the ground beneath them. The Marines followed their paths like lifelines, advancing behind the moving walls of dirt. "You didn't go anywhere without a dozer," one Marine said. "They were our angels, made of steel. Even tanks depended on them." Bulldozers cleared paths across the beaches so the Shermans could advance. When enemy shells cratered the runways, bulldozers filled them within hours, allowing planes to land supplies or evacuate the wounded. By day 3, the bulldozers were as essential as rifles. By day 10, they had reshaped entire portions of Iwo Jima's coastline. But it wasn't just what they built, it was what they represented. They embodied the American doctrine of inevitability. Every shovel of dirt said the same thing. You can delay us, you can wound us, but you cannot stop us. That mindset, that forward motion, became the psychological engine of the Pacific War. Japanese defenders fought to the last man, but even as they died, the island beneath them was being remade. Runways were carved out before the battle even ended. Airstrips took shape while gunfire still echoed in the distance. When the last pockets of resistance were crushed, American planes were already landing on those same runways, built by men who had fought their way across the sand with bulldozers instead of guns. In the end, victory on Iwo Jima didn't belong only to the men who charged forward, but also to those who pushed forward. Those who turned machines of peace into weapons of survival. Those who fought the earth itself and won. When historians speak of Iwo Jima, they remember the flag on Mount Suribachi, the moment of triumph frozen in a single photograph. But somewhere below that mountain, half buried in the black sand, was another symbol of victory, a rusted bulldozer, its blade still facing forward. It didn't need a flag. It was the flag. When the last gun fell silent on Iwo Jima in March 1945, the island looked nothing like the place Japan had fortified. What had once been a volcanic death trap was now a latticework of roads, runways, and supply zones built in real time, under fire, by machines never designed for war. Nearly 7,000 U.S. Marines were dead. More than 20,000 Japanese soldiers had fought to the last breath. The ground itself had been reshaped, scarred, leveled, and buried beneath layers of black ash and twisted steel. But amid the devastation stood one undeniable truth. Without the bulldozers, the victory might never have come. The Seabees machines had done what artillery and air power could not. They controlled the terrain. In a war where geography often dictated fate, the bulldozer became the weapon that defied nature. By the time the battle ended, bulldozers had carved 3 full airfields into Iwo Jima. The first was operational just days after the initial landings, before the island was even secure. It was from those same runways that crippled B-29 bombers, returning from raids over Japan, would later make emergency landings, saving more than 27,000 American airmen. That number alone made the bloodshed on Iwo Jima part of a larger, grim calculation, an island sacrificed for a lifeline. Each time a wounded B-29 came down safely on the black sand strip, the legacy of the bulldozer deepened. They hadn't just changed the battlefield, they had changed the aftermath. What made these machines extraordinary wasn't their design, but the men behind them. The Seabees were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were construction workers turned soldiers, electricians, welders, and engineers who built as they fought. On Iwo Jima, they often worked 20-hour days, clearing mines, digging graves, and carving roads to move the wounded back to aid stations. Their bulldozers hauled food, water, and ammunition across fields where no vehicle should have survived. When asked later how they endured it, one Seabee said quietly, "You didn't think about dying. You thought about finishing the job." That attitude, relentless, practical, unflinching, reflected the industrial soul of America's war effort. The bulldozer became the embodiment of that spirit. Not glamorous, not heroic in the traditional sense, but absolutely essential. Captured Japanese diaries and intelligence reports revealed something striking. The defenders were not simply shocked by American firepower, they were terrified by the bulldozers. They described them as iron beasts that swallow the land, unstoppable even under direct fire. Some units even reported that their firing angles had to be adjusted, because the terrain kept changing. The bulldozers were literally altering the battlefield faster than their defenses could adapt. In psychological terms, this was devastating. The Japanese military doctrine of defense in depth, layer upon layer of hidden strongpoints, depended on terrain consistency. When the very ground shifted under their feet, that doctrine collapsed, and so, paradoxically, a machine built for peace became an instrument of psychological warfare. After Iwo Jima, bulldozers became standard in every major U.S. military operation. From Okinawa to the Korean Peninsula, from Vietnam to the Persian Gulf, they were no longer just tools, they were tactical assets. The concept of combat engineering was born directly from what the Seabees achieved in the Pacific. Militaries worldwide began to see that victory wasn't only about firepower, it was about mobility, terrain, and control. Every modern armored bulldozer, from the IDF's D-9s in the Middle East to the U.S. Army's assault breacher vehicles, traces its lineage to those crude, salt-stained machines that first rolled onto Iwo Jima's beaches. Yet, for decades after the war, few spoke of them. The bulldozers didn't have medals. They didn't appear in victory parades. They were left behind, rusting on the black sands or scrapped for parts once the airfields were built. But their legacy lived in the ground itself. When the war ended and peace returned, Japan, the very nation that had once feared those machines, would later import thousands of bulldozers from America. They rebuilt their shattered cities using the same technology that had once buried their bunkers. It was a strange, poetic reversal. Machines of war became instruments of rebirth. Among the Seabees, over 500 were killed in combat across the Pacific, many while operating their bulldozers under direct enemy fire. Their memorials, when they exist, often list them not by unit or rank, but simply by their trade. Carpenter, mechanic, driver. It is a quiet kind of heroism, the kind history rarely celebrates, but always depends on. One surviving Seabee said, decades later, "We didn't see ourselves as heroes. We just had a job to do, but when you see that machine still standing after a bombardment, and you know you built something that mattered, that's enough." Today, Iwo Jima remains Japanese territory. Visitors are rare. The airfields still exist, though overgrown, and the wind still blows over the same black sand where the bulldozers once worked. Beneath that ground lie layers of history, twisted steel, bones of the fallen, and traces of the machines that changed everything. Every now and then, an excavation uncovers one, a corroded track, a blade half buried in volcanic dust. Time has claimed their metal, but not their meaning. They stand as silent monuments to a truth born in war, that the power to destroy and the power to build are often the same. It is how we use them that defines us. The bulldozer was not designed for heroism. It did not carry guns or armor or glory. But in the Pacific, it carried the weight of victory. It leveled jungles, raised airfields, buried fear, and built hope. One blade of dirt at a time. And long after the war ended, its legacy rolled on, wherever men turned chaos into order, ruin into rebuilding, and destruction into design. Because on Iwo Jima, America's bulldozers did more than move Earth. They moved history itself. In every war, there are machines that define the fight. The tanks, the guns, the planes. But sometimes, the machines that change history aren't built for battle at all. The bulldozer was one of them. It had no armor plating, no cannon, no turret. Yet it achieved what weapons could not. It conquered terrain, fear, and time itself, reshaping the very face of war. On Iwo Jima, in Okinawa, in the Philippines, these steel workhorses carried a message that transcended the conflict, that progress and destruction can share the same engine, that civilization's tools can become its shields when necessity demands it. When the Japanese soldiers first watched America's bulldozers crawl through the fire, they saw something almost mythic. A force that didn't stop, didn't retreat, didn't hesitate. It symbolized the industrial heart of the Allied war effort. A nation that could build faster than its enemies could, destroy. And in that realization lay the true secret of victory. Chitimo, bulldozer represented more than mechanical strength. It represented a philosophy, that mastery of terrain, logistics, and adaptability would define the modern battlefield. Its blade became a metaphor for the 20th century itself, cutting through obstacles, clearing paths, building the future from the wreckage of the present. When the war ended, many of these same machines returned home, to plow fields, build highways, and raise cities. They carved the runways of peace just as they had carved the paths of war. And though the world rarely remembers their names, the earth remembers their mark. Every leveled beachhead, every emergency runway, every rebuilt city that rose from the Ashes of World War II, Sarfantradadrida, Kidantinohon, Amasatintai, Hadsnoon, all bear the invisible signature of the bulldozer's blade. It is the unsung hero of an age defined by its extremes, proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, creation can still outlast destruction. So when history speaks of power, it often mentions bombs and guns, but the real power is the one that builds. Because on the black sands of Iwo Jima, when America's bulldozers became weapons, they didn't just win a battle. They reshaped what power meant forever.